Adjusting your position now so that you're sitting comfortably. And feel free to have the eyes closed, or if you prefer, open, but without fixing your gaze on anything in particular if your eyes are open. Allowing the body to become steady. And using the breath as a vehicle toward deeper stillness, take a few deeper breaths in now, followed by a long, relaxing exhalation, letting go of our conversations, letting go of questions, and feeling embodied in the chair. Perhaps your feet are connected to the floor or stretched out on the bed. And noticing how we experience the body through the senses. The sense of touch, body touching the chair, the legs and feet connected to the floor or support, the clothing or coverings connected to the body. Perhaps the hands are resting in the lap. Noticing the sense of touch. And on a more subtle level, the sense of the touch of breath in the nostrils, temperature of breath in the nostrils. Shift to the sense of hearing, noticing sounds you can hear. Sounds in the room, the building, or out in the distance. Noticing internal sounds. You may experience the sense of smell. As the eyes are closed, the experience of sight may be internal. And notice what is observing the senses. The witness. And on a more subtle level, the arising of thought. Science tells us there's between 60,000 and 90,000 thoughts arising in any one day, and that 80% of those thoughts are repetitive thoughts. Those thoughts that loop and demand our attention again and again. Notice arising thoughts, and also notice the gap between the thoughts. As peaceful presence arises naturally, these gaps are wider, longer. And as we maintain this attitude of witnessing the arising thoughts, and we refuse to feed them with our ongoing attention, notice the thought quickly passes. Begin to observe if you are feeding certain thoughts, and how they then give rise to another and another and another. And we find ourselves on the mind train, looping around, skipping from thought to thought. Expand the awareness now, open from thinking to include all that arises in the realm of experience. Resting in open, aware presence. This includes all sensation, all experience, and non-experience. And if the attention tries to zoom in on any one experience, expand it out again to include all, a limitless, open, aware presence. And allowing this experience of open, aware presence without limitations, including all that is, moment to moment, fully present. without judgment, without expectation. And at the same time, take 3 deep breaths. And we'll remain in this open, aware presence as we continue on with satsang. Aware of the body, aware of the space, aware of whatever's arising moment to moment. Namaste. And this is a way we can live our lives. Remaining open, remaining conscious, aware, accepting whatever's arising in each moment, whether that be thought, whether that be experience of smell, whether that be a visual experience, or all of these experiences, being open in this way to whatever is arising is a different way of living. What we tend to do is we zoom in, and particularly on those repetitive thoughts. And we focus on those repetitive thoughts. And, you know, I've given that analogy before of a constant drip on stone will eventually wear a pattern into the stone. In the same way, a continual focus on a thought pattern will create a deep intrinsic pattern in our psyche. And whether that pattern is linked to a belief that is, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, whatever it is, these are just 2 very, very common beliefs. And then around that will dance all the thoughts to support that belief. And in this way, we develop strong patterns. But as we begin to choose to live and continue to open up and be present to all that's arising moment by moment by moment, and initially reminding ourselves again and again and again. And we will slip back into the doo-doo, we'll slip back into those old patterns. But we'll also begin to notice how often they arise and how often they pull us in like quicksand, reinforcing that there's something wrong. So in this way, deep patterns begin to emerge in our psyche. And as we live from those patterns, we make choices from the beliefs associated with those patterns. But as we begin to live in open, aware presence and we recognize that these patterns are repeating, that these are repetitive thoughts, we begin to see through them. And this can be partly a process of self-inquiry, where we may find ourselves repeating certain behaviors. I could use a simple behavior like, picking up, it's not a mobile phone, but picking up a mobile phone and scrolling through or checking how many people liked my post because I need validation for being loved. But we could question ourselves, why am I doing this? Why have I found myself doing this? And it might simply, there might be nothing behind it, but it could be that I want to see how many people have liked my post so that I feel validated and loved. Questioning, what is behind some of our behavior can be quite scary, but quite enlightening at the same time.
Yeah, it's always important to remember who is there a difference between the patterns and the observer of the patterns? Or is there a difference between the thought and the thinker of the thought? Or are they one and the same thing? Automation is something that happens which is a kind of repetitive thing which keeps on repeating the same patterns over and over again. And to try and change those patterns, we think, well, I have some control over those patterns. But the patterns themselves are just playing out as a kind of automation. So we create a kind of separation between me and my patterns, me and my thoughts, me and my experiences. But the thing is, to become aware of anything, we have to have a separate viewer or experiencer or thinker. And that creates a separation, which is not really true. And
so perhaps the automation or the automated thoughts, is that the sense of separate self? Yes, because the only one who can observe is the I am, the one thing that we all are, that we're all the same in that. And we're all the same in the mechanisms that express in the field of separation. I am expressing as this entity, Soraya and Terry, etc.
So the real witness is an impartial observer. It is not.
It's not I, the separate self.
No, the separate self is the automation. And that is an automatic process, which is patterns of behavior, patterns of ways of seeing, which is based upon the principle of choosing or seeing something as good, something as bad, trying to avoid the bad, trying to move towards the good. And when this process of choosing between good and bad comes to an end, then you have just a simple witnessing and observing of things with no judgment. And this allows the patterns to play out because there's no effort to try to change them. It's just like they're passing through. And so there's no attachment to those patterns. There's no longer an attachment to the thinking or an attachment to the experiencing. There's the allowing of that as a kind of passing through. And that implies acceptance of what is passing through also. And this is like entering the flow of creation rather than trying to change it to suit my preferences.
And to make the other wrong and justify the sense of the separate self by making I am right, they are wrong. This is the way because it suits the automated self here, which is made up of all the patterns that have developed here. Whereas once we are resting as open, aware presence, noticing all arisings equally without resistance. So it's releasing all resistance to what is present in any one moment. There can still be some preferences. Obviously, there will always be some preferences depending on the flavor here. So we all have a different flavor. Terry has Terryness as his flavor. There's Sorayaness here. There's Brittanness there, and etc., etc. However, in that open, aware presence, all is welcome here. Whatever is arising is accepted without resistance, may not be chosen or moved towards, but it is seen for what it is rather than, if I put on a different pair of glasses and those glasses are coloured by my patterns, the automations that are running here. So we all wear perceiving glasses coloured by the automated patterns that are running here. As those patterns fall away, the screen of perception becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, and we see and experience life as it is without the added comment and judgment from our automated automations, our past trauma, our fears, our cravings, our aversions, our egoic separate self.
And by allowing those patterns to play out, they tend to dissipate because we're not trying to change them, we're not trying to improve ourselves, we're trying to constantly make things better.
We're not feeding the monster, so the monster doesn't grow. This is a conversation here. We are all the same in the mechanics of mind, the mechanics of being human and having this human experience. But we're also all the same in that we are beautiful, perfect, clear consciousness. But that consciousness is having to shine through all the automations and patterns that we've taken on in this life. And this is what distorts pure peace, pure reality as it's unfolding moment by moment by moment. Yeah, some interesting thoughts that you've had there. number one, I really don't think we have to do anything, and to love everything that arises. Why do we even have to feed it with that? Just noticing what arises and letting it pass. We don't need to feed the arising thoughts. Thought happens. And we've been trained, from childhood to believe that we are our thoughts. Now, thought is powerful, and we can and do create our lives through the thoughts that we feed. So it's really important to not to go down the rabbit hole by exploring every thought that arises. Thought can just come and go in an instant. All is welcome here. Let it come, but let it go. It is important that we stay in the flow, but as soon as we get into a little eddy, the river flows from the mountain to the ocean, and that can be a clear flow, but sometimes it gets into a little eddy and a little whirlpool, and we can be stuck in that whirlpool of thinking for a very long time. Or we can be trying to paddle upstream, making, no, this can't be happening, resisting what's happening. But allowing and remaining, coming back to presence all the time, to be that open, aware present, to be in flow, not to be stuck. And ruminating is not a healthy activity. Better to stay present with what is happening, the walking that's happening, perhaps, the washing the dishes that's happening, perhaps, the gardening that's happening. Staying with that and letting the thoughts can go on, but we don't have to pull them down and marinate in them, because that can be very unhealthy. And having this idea of having to love something is not really understanding what love is. We have so many false concepts around this idea of love. Many associated with romantic love or attraction or beauty. Love is total acceptance. Love is free and peaceful. And there's no compulsion with it at all. It either is or it isn't. Would you like to share something there, Tim? So, better to stay present at this stage and notice what's going on, but avoid being sucked in to that vacuum of repetitive thinking. Because this, again, we've talked about this sense of the separate self, which is the patterned self, which is the egoic self, the self that is incomplete, the self that is traumatized, the self that is not the most loving presence. And then there's the self that we all are, the I am, the consciousness, the one, where we melt as one. And whenever we go into thinking, who is doing the thinking? The separate self is doing the thinking. The patterned self is doing the thinking. The blind is leading the blind. When we rest back as presence, observing what's arising, allowing what's arising, that is where wisdom can begin to arise, as we start to see through the patterns. The veil starts to get a little thinner as we, and we can do this with such fun, it can be hilarious. I have laughed at what the mind can come up with sometimes. Not so heavy to really laugh at it and think, wow, there you go again. Look at that.
Yes, Soraya and I, we're always bouncing off each other and watching the way the mind is constantly creating these complications and trying to repeat patterns, and we help each other to just sort of,
it's hilarious,
just stay light with it, and it's very amusing.
And in the early days when, Terry and I met when we were older, so there was already some patterns there. I was sort of answering a little bit about what you said there, Pete, before, and we used to notice that there was patterns here and patterns there, and that sometimes those patterns would be less than loving. So we gave ourselves little pseudo names. I was Cleopatra, and this was Antonio or Tony.
Tony, yeah. So Tony would sort of rear his head occasionally and try to make himself known in a way, and Soraya would immediately recognise him and say, "Oh, Tony, hi.
Yeah,
you're
down
back."
boy.
And we help each other to stay
present,
basically.
Present to the interplay and the old habits that had been in relationship and were arising, until we haven't played that game for a very long time now, because we've reached a beautiful place in our relationship. But it was very, very helpful to bring the humor in. I was Cleopatra the Queen.
Sometimes Miss Bossy Britches.
Miss Bossy Britches occasionally. Yeah, and we won't talk about Terry, but but that was really, really helpful to bring the humor in. And rather than as soon as you point the finger out to the other person, you're doing da 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 da. But if you can laugh at yourself and laugh at the other and laugh at two separate egoic selves clashing.
And part of that is realizing that we're all equal, totally equal in that. It's not a competition. The automation is the same in everybody. Essentially, the mechanics of that automation is the same. Reaction to a stimulus based upon past experience, and constantly taking the past and trying to throw it onto the future to make things nice and safe and recognizable. And if we see that in action, it can be quite funny when you actually see the constant way it tries to reproduce itself as a separate entity.
But also beginning to recognize how that occurred sometimes becomes very, very obvious, that there was perhaps a lack of love in childhood, or a lack of recognition in childhood, or a lack of mothering or fathering in childhood. And then one takes on a certain neediness or a role in relationship as they get older. And to see that with compassion as well. Humor is great, but also compassion and kindness, that there's a recognition there that, perhaps there was, a sad little child that didn't receive the love that they felt they needed at that time. So they're seeking it everywhere now. Or there could have been a child that was criticized at every move. So now they're just anticipating the next criticism all the time and taking everything as a slight. So obviously there's this trauma that happens, but again, it happens to the separate egoic self. Consciousness is love. Consciousness is pure experience without adding anything to it.
I think I'm struck with the paradox of being open to what's arising, and yet I'm pissed off with what's arising, and I want to distract myself from it because I know that what's arising and what is causing me to be concerned with the fact that the lawnmower doesn't work is irrelevant. But yet the only way I can get away from that, being constructed by the minutiae of life, which lead to going down the rabbit hole of thinking, there's a part of me that doesn't want to be there witnessing it and open to it. I'd much prefer if it wasn't there. So how do I move to that point? Well, my way has always been through trying to distract myself, because then at least I'm not being constructed by whatever the shit that I'm having to deal with is. So I hear what you're saying, that if I can stay open to it, if I can stay present to it, maybe it will dissipate and go. But maybe it...
Perhaps if the lawnmower doesn't want to go right now, the universe is directing you to do something else and come back to the lawnmower later. I hear what you're saying, though, Sebastian, and basically we have to get to a point that we're so sick of ourselves, we're so over the game, that we want out. Because yes, life is a drama, and if we are addicted to the drama, that ongoing drama, we want to be in that. We want to get pissed off. We want to get angry. It's juicy. It's fun. It's interesting. But to step out of that, there comes a point where we've had enough. Because it's also suffering. And are we attached to suffering? Is there some investment in suffering as well? It's quite fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and as I say, I come back to the fact that stepping out from it, for me, my way is through distraction, but that doesn't actually solve it, because you still come back to it. It still raises its head. So being present to it
takes courage.
pain in the neck.
It takes enormous amount of courage to be present to what's arising when what's arising is really uncomfortable. And I don't mean to dwell in it or marinate in it or roll like a pig in the mud in it, but just to be with, for instance, if suddenly, this feeling of anxiety or anger comes to me, to just be with that rather than running away to change it, or turning that anger outward and yelling at my partner or my children or whatever, to be with that and to own that and to go, wow, this feeling of anger or anxiety is arising. How do I know that? I'm feeling a churning in my stomach. I'm feeling a stuckness in my heart. It's really uncomfortable. I'm just going to let that be there. And notice what's behind that. What is behind that? I'm feeling hurt. Okay, well, I'm feeling hurt. Then you could investigate, what is it I need from that? Well, maybe I need to be heard. So perhaps I need to calm down and then express myself in a better way so that I feel heard and that anger's not there anymore. That can be very helpful too. Do you follow that?
Yeah.
rather than distracting, if we can remain open and aware and present to the arising bodily sensations, rather than I'm angry. Okay, how do I know I'm angry? I can feel that churning in my gut. I can feel my muscles tensing. Break it down to that. And then from that experience in the body, okay, this is stuck energy. Where does this come from? I need to feel heard. Someone didn't hear me. Perhaps that can now happen.
And it boils down to being in the present moment, and that to the separate self is emptiness, to be avoided at all costs, because there's no room for the separate self in the present moment, because present moment has nothing in it that will support the existence of separation. So the word avoid, it means you're trying to get away from the void. You're trying to get away from the void, and the void is the bottom line of what we're most afraid of. The separate self is most afraid of the void because it is death to the separate self. Present moment has no problems in it.
And we feel that this void is empty and unsubstantial, but actually, when we do rest in the open, aware presence or the emptiness, it is so full and it is so peaceful, and it is our natural state, is peaceful presence. If we can let go of wanting to hold on to the patterns of the egoic separate identity, which is wanting to run the show all the time. And again, we can just keep questioning, okay, I want to avoid this feeling. Who wants to avoid this feeling? The ego wants to avoid this feeling. The separate self wants to avoid this feeling because it's uncomfortable and it might lead into a deeper space of openness. Because the separate egoic patterned self, the automations that are running here, they do not want to die. They want to maintain ownership over this entity.